China controls 80% of the elements that make modern life possible, and that single sentence should unsettle anyone who uses a smartphone or drives an electric car. You probably assume components flow freely across borders like ideas, but raw materials rarely obey the rules you expect. In this video, you will follow how a small group of 17 chemical elements came to matter so much, how China built a near monopoly on them, and why that control becomes a geopolitical weapon in unexpected ways. What happened next will shock you, and it begins with a list of elements you have almost certainly never thought about. To understand the story, you need to know what rare earth elements actually are, and the phrase sounds stranger than the reality it describes. Rare earths are a group of 17 chemical elements that share similar properties, and despite their name, they are not always rare in the earth. As crust, you should also know that these elements are chemically tricky and physically useful in small doses, and that paradox, common in the crust, rare and usable concentrations, explains much of the economic and political tension you will see. But here's where it gets interesting, because those properties make them essential in technologies you depend on every day. The 17 rare earth elements are lanthanum, cerium, praseodymium, neodymium, promethium, samarium, europium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, holmium, erbium, thulium, luterbium, lutetium, scandium, and yttrium. And that long list is where modern magnets, electronics, and optics find their power. You will notice names that look like ancient places, but their modern importance lies in tiny amounts powering devices like phones and lasers. You should remember neodymium and dysprosium especially, because they are the core ingredients of high-strength permanent magnets. And those magnets are the secret engines behind motors, turbines, and guidance systems. What happens when a handful of countries control the flow of these elements is what turns chemistry into strategy. The uses of rare earths read like a map of modern life, and almost every important technology depends on at least one of these elements. You should imagine your phone, the tiny speaker magnets, the camera optics, and the display lighting all working because of rare earth materials that you never see. You should also imagine larger systems like electric vehicle motors, wind turbine generators, and precision guided munitions relying on the same family of elements, because those technologies demand strong magnets and specialized alloys that only rare earths can reliably provide. The more you depend on modern tech, the more you depend on these elements. Mining rare earths is not a simple hole in the ground, and you will soon see that extraction and processing are two different battles. You should picture remote deposits, complicated chemistry for separating elements, and a multi-step industrial chain that turns ore into high-purity materials. You should also recognize that the step from mined ore to usable metal is the most technologically intensive and toxic, because separation involves strong acids, heavy waste streams, and sophisticated chemical expertise that is hard to scale safely. That technological bottleneck is exactly where market power concentrates, and where nations can exert leverage. The environmental cost of rare earth mining reads like a hidden ledger of damage, and you should worry about the price the planet pays for your convenience. You will hear stories of toxic tailings, contaminated water, and landscapes scarred by acid baths that strip minerals from crushed rock. You should also understand that environmental concerns pushed many Western mines to close or slow down production over the last few decades, because cleanup was expensive and regulation was strict, and those decisions created an opening that others eagerly filled. What happened next is the economic and geopolitical story you are watching unfold. Before China's rise, the rare earth market was more diverse, and you should imagine smaller producers scattered across continents supplying specialized industries. You will see that the 1980s and 1990s had a mosaic of mines, particularly in the United States, Australia, and parts of Africa. Feeding Western manufacturing directly, you should also recall that market prices fell as production increased globally, and that cheap output from new players made Western companies complacent about supply security and environmental costs. But complacency is fragile, and the next decades rewrote who had power over these crucial inputs. China's rise in rare earths was not accidental, and you should think of it as deliberate policy meeting industrial muscle. You will find a combination of state support, lax environmental enforcement, and strategic investment that allowed China to undercut competitors and scale processing facilities quickly. You should also note that China invested in the entire value chain from mining to separation and refining, because controlling processing is where most of the profit and strategic value sits. But how did that translate into a near monopoly on global trade, and why did other countries miss the warning signs? Processing, not just mining, is where China gained the upper hand, and you should understand that this is the critical distinction most people miss. You will learn that while other countries held deposits, China built the chemical plants and know how to separate and purify rare earth elements at industrial scale. You should remember the figure that matters. China controls around 90% of global rare earth processing capacity, And this processing bottleneck confers technological and political leverage far beyond simple mining numbers. But raw percentages only tell part of the story. And the next chapter explains why supply concentration becomes a weapon. China today produces roughly 80% of the world's rare earths. And you should let that number sink in, because it changes how industries plan and governments worry. You will see supply chains for everything from smartphones to satellites running through a narrow funnel that sits firmly within China's borders. You should also know that China's market share was built over decades through policy choices and market dynamics, and that concentration amplifies risk in ways globalized thinking often underestimates. What happened next shows how that control can be used as leverage in geopolitical disputes. In 2010, China restricted rare earth exports to Japan during a political spat, and you should think of that incident as a case study in modern resource coercion. You will find that the move caused immediate price spikes, industry panic, and a sudden recognition that supply chains had a geopolitical choke point. You should also note that what seemed like a temporary dispute taught governments and companies that rare earths were not purely economic goods, but strategic assets that could be weaponized when diplomacy turned sour. What happened next forced a painful strategic reassessment in capitals around the world. China has used its market power more subtly since 2010, and you should pay attention to the patterns that emerge in trade data and policy moves. You will notice export quotas, strategic investments in downstream industries, and diplomatic leverage deployed in ways that rarely make headlines at first. You should also recognize that weaponizing supply is both economic and psychological, because companies must plan for interruptions that could halt production of critical technologies at a moment's notice. But the vulnerability is particularly dangerous when military systems rely on the same inputs as consumer products. Your phone and the tiny magnet in its speaker depend on rare earths, and you should accept that everyday convenience masks strategic exposure. You will learn that consumer tech industries have thin margins and just-in-time supply chains, which makes them especially sensitive to sudden changes in raw material access. You should also imagine the cascade effects if rare earth supplies tightened, because small disruptions at the component level can ripple up to slow production lines, raise prices, and trigger geopolitical friction between manufacturers and governments. What happens in consumer tech is only part of the picture. The green energy transition depends on rare earths more than you probably realize, and you should understand the irony that technologies meant to save the planet create new resource dependencies. You will find that electric vehicle motors, wind turbine generators, and energy-efficient transformers all rely on high performance magnets made from neodymium and dysprosium. You should also note that scaling renewable energy quickly increases demand for rare earths dramatically, and that surge in demand hits precisely when supply remains concentrated, creating both price volatility and strategic vulnerability for countries racing to decarbonize. So where does the military fit into this web? Modern military systems are not immune to this dependency, and you should realize that advanced fighters, guidance systems, and sonar arrays all use rare earth materials. You will learn that platforms like the F-35 require components made from rare earths for miniaturized motors, sensors, and communication systems that modern warfare depends upon. You should also understand that the Pentagon has repeatedly flagged this dependency as a critical vulnerability, and that military planners worry about access to materials during conflict or prolonged diplomatic tension. The national security stakes make rare earths a strategic dilemma, not just an industrial one. The United States once led rare earth production, and you should remember that domestic deposits exist, but were neglected for decades. You will hear the story of how environmental concerns, low prices, and regulatory burdens pushed many Western mines into dormancy and left processing to cheaper competitors abroad. You should also focus on the Mountain Pass mine in California, a facility that was once a global leader before it closed in the early 2000s and later restarted under new ownership, because its history encapsulates the trade-offs between environmental regulation, economic survival, and strategic necessity. How the U.S. is responding matters now. Mountain Pass reopened, and the United States has invested in domestic production and processing capacity, and you should view these moves as strategic insurance rather than purely commercial ventures. You will find federal grants, private investments, and Pentagon contracts aimed at rebuilding parts of the rare earth supply chain on American soil. You should also know that restarting a complex processing industry takes time, expertise, and environmental oversight, and that near-term supply still depends heavily on imports and international partnerships. That is why allies and new producers are a crucial part of the next chapter. Australia's Lynas is trying to be the alternative to Chinese supply, and you should understand that private companies can reshape strategic equations when states cannot act quickly enough. You will see Lynas operate mines in Australia while building processing plants in Malaysia and planning additional facilities to serve global demand. You should also consider the political sensitivity of hosting processing plants, because environmental concerns and local opposition can complicate efforts to build reliable supply chains outside China. The global response so far is a mix of private initiative and public policy nudges. Recycling and material substitution are often presented as solutions, and you should treat these options as part of a diverse toolkit rather than silver bullets. You will learn that recycling rare earths from old electronics is technically possible, but economically challenging because the elements are dispersed in tiny amounts across many products. You should also see research into alternative magnet chemistries and reduced rare earth designs, but scaling these alternatives to industrial levels takes time and sustained investment, which means short-term dependence remains stubbornly high. So what happens to the economics of supply and demand? Supply chain bottlenecks amplify price swings and strategic anxiety, and you should imagine markets reacting violently to small policy shifts or diplomatic incidents. You will notice that futures, inventory strategies, and stockpiling become tools states and corporations use to buffer against shocks in a concentrated market. You should also bear in mind that price incentives can encourage new production and recycling, but they can also lead to boom and bust cycles that discourage long-term investment in cleaner processing technologies. The economic incentives and political maneuvers will define who wins the next decade. Geopolitically, the monopoly creates options for coercion and deterrence, and you should understand this dynamic as a modern variation of resource diplomacy. You will see how control of critical inputs can substitute for military power in some contexts because it allows a country to influence industrial output globally without firing a shot. You should also imagine how alliances might shift as nations seek secure access to materials, because economic dependence creates leverage that can alter diplomatic relationships and defense planning in significant ways. The next strategic battleground might not be territorial at all. The green energy transition increases demand for rare earths and intensifies strategic competition. And you should accept the paradox that sustainability goals create new geopolitical pressures. You will find that scaling electric vehicles and wind power requires much more in the way of magnets and specialized alloys than previous infrastructure projects did. You should also imagine scenarios where countries race to secure long-term contracts, invest in extraction overseas, and subsidize domestic processing to avoid being left dependent on a single supplier. The choices made now will shape industrial competitiveness and security for decades. Several future scenarios are plausible, depending on investment, diplomacy, and technological breakthroughs, and you should think of these possibilities as a branching map rather than a single outcome. You will see a range from successful diversification and cleaner processing to continued concentration and strategic instability. You should also consider that breakthroughs in material science, increased recycling, or cooperative international frameworks could dramatically alter the landscape, and that the window for steering these outcomes is open but closing as demand accelerates. Which path will global leaders take? The story of rare earths is ultimately about power disguised as chemistry, and you should see how control over small atoms translates into geopolitical leverage with outsized consequences. You will realize that resources can be weapons when supply chains are concentrated and democracies forget to secure their raw material needs. You should also feel the urgency because the same elements that build a cleaner future can also become geopolitical choke points if diversification and sustainable practices are not accelerated. The question for you is what kind of future we choose to engineer. If this video gave you a new perspective, you should think about the implicit choices behind every technology you use, and you should understand that consumer decisions ripple into geopolitics whether you intend them to or not. You will see that energy policy, industrial strategy, and international alliances are all linked by these small but vital elements. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe and follow for more explainers that connect hidden resources with real-world power. And remember that the next geopolitical crisis might be decided by the chemistry you cannot see. Thank you for watching, and stay curious.